Chosen one before anything else moves forward. Let everything inside you come to a complete stop. Let your thoughts slow down. Let the noise of the day fade into the background. This is not just another message scrolling past your screen. This is not coincidence. This is not random timing. This is a divine briefing, and your spirit already knows it. That subtle shift you have been feeling over the last few days was not imagination. The sudden heaviness when you entered certain spaces, the tension that tightened your chest for no clear reason, the unexplainable alertness that rose up when someone smiled at you and said all the right things, while something inside you whispered that something was off. You tried to reason it away. You told yourself you were tired, overstimulated, maybe overthinking. But deep down, your spirit never agreed with that explanation. And today, heaven is interrupting your doubt to confirm what your intuition has been warning you about. You are not paranoid. You are not unstable. Your discernment is active. Your spiritual senses are functioning exactly as they were designed to function. There has been quiet observation around you. Someone has been watching, not always with obvious hostility, not with loud confrontation, but with subtle curiosity and calculated attention. They have been monitoring your growth, studying your reactions, tracking your progress in ways you cannot always see with your natural eyes. And the reason you could feel it is because your frequency has been rising. When light increases, shadows become aware. When elevation begins, attention follows. This is not meant to frighten you. It is meant to prepare you. Because the truth is, you are standing on the edge of a breakthrough that is larger than you realize. And before promotion, there is always testing. Before expansion, there is always evaluation. This message is not coming to stir fear, but to anchor focus. It is a divine appointment in the timeline of your life. You were scheduled to hear this at this exact moment, because heaven does not allow its chosen ones to walk blindly into new territory without instruction. The enemy would prefer that you dismiss this scroll away, get distracted, or convince yourself that this is exaggeration. Distraction is their favorite weapon. If they can scatter your focus, they can delay your advantage. But if you remain still, if you stay locked in, if you refuse to let your attention wander, you gain insight that shifts the battlefield entirely. This introduction is not hype. It is alignment. You are being briefed because you are valuable. You are being warned because you are advancing. And the very fact that there has been quiet monitoring is proof that what you carry is significant. So do not tense up. Do not let anxiety hijack your breathing. Instead, become steady. Let your spirit anchor. Let your mind settle into clarity. Because what you are about to understand will not only expose what has been happening around you, it will equip you to move forward with strategy instead of reaction. The enemy wants you scattered. Heaven wants you centered. The enemy wants you emotional. Heaven wants you aware. And the advantage belongs to the one who can remain still long enough to hear the strategy. Stay with this, hold your focus. Because what feels like pressure right now is actually preparation, and this divine briefing is the doorway into your next level. Now that your spirit is steady and your focus is anchored, you must understand the true nature of what has been happening around you, because spiritual surveillance rarely announces itself with noise or obvious confrontation. It operates quietly, patiently, almost politely. The enemy does not always burst into your life with chaos and visible attack. More often, they observe, they study, they gather data, they wait. Surveillance is subtle by design. It does not want to be detected because its power depends on remaining unnoticed. That is why the interactions that unsettled you did not look aggressive on the surface. They looked normal, harmless, even friendly. A message that says, "Hey, just checking in," a sudden curiosity about your plans, a casual question about your progress, a smile that feels slightly too measured. To the natural mind, these moments seem insignificant, but your body reacted before your logic could override it. Your chest tightened, your stomach knotted, your breathing shifted ever so slightly, and immediately your brain tried to defend the other person. Maybe they mean well. Maybe you are projecting. Maybe you are reading too much into it. But what if that internal alert was not anxiety? What if it was intelligence, because spiritual surveillance does not always gather information through force? It gathers it through access. It wants you comfortable enough to reveal details voluntarily. It wants you relaxed enough to overshare. It wants you emotionally triggered enough to expose what you are building before it is ready to be seen. Those phony check-ins are reconnaissance missions disguised as kindness. They are not always malicious in a dramatic sense, but they are curious in a strategic sense. They are audits. They are temperature checks. They are attempts to measure whether you are still struggling, whether you are still doubting, whether you are still accessible. And that is why discernment becomes your greatest protection. Discernment is not suspicion. Discernment is not cynicism. It is not assuming the worst about everyone. It is a gift from the Holy Spirit designed to protect what heaven has planted inside you. Discernment does not scream. It whispers. It does not accuse. It alerts. It creates a subtle internal shift that says, "Pay attention." And you must learn to trust that signal without letting it turn into fear. Because the moment you ignore discernment, you hand over information that was meant to stay guarded. And the moment you turn discernment into paranoia, you sabotage relationships that were not threats. Balance is the key. You are not called to isolate yourself from humanity. You are called to operate with awareness. The concept of auditing your vibration is deeper than most realize. When someone engages you during a season of growth, they are not always asking about your external life. They are measuring your internal state. Are you still reactive? Are you still insecure? Are you still broadcasting stress? Or have you stabilized? Have you matured? Have you grown quiet in your confidence? Spiritual surveillance attempts to detect fluctuations in your frequency. When you are anxious, you are easier to read. When you are frustrated, you are easier to provoke. When you are desperate for validation, you are easier to manipulate. But when you are grounded, when you are calm, when you are secure in what God has shown you, the data becomes limited. That tightening you felt in your body was not random. The body often detects what the mind has not processed yet. Your nervous system is an instrument. It registers inconsistencies in tone and intention, in spiritual alignment. Instead of silencing that response, you must become curious about it. Ask yourself why your energy shifted. Ask what part of the conversation felt extracting rather than connecting. Emotional tightening is not always fear. Sometimes it is revelation. It is your internal compass adjusting. And here is where maturity comes in. You do not confront every subtle discomfort. You do not accuse every curious person. You do not react defensively. Instead, you observe. You adjust your level of disclosure. You speak in generalities when necessary. You answer without revealing the blueprint. You remain gracious but guarded. Because spiritual surveillance feeds on emotional leakage. The more you explain yourself, the more material you provide. The more you try to prove your progress, the more angles are created for criticism or sabotage. But when you are steady, when you do not feel compelled to defend or impress, the monitoring becomes ineffective. This is not about living in fear of people. It is about understanding that not everyone who asks a question deserves the full answer. Not everyone who smiles needs access to your strategy. Not everyone who inquires is entitled to your revelation. Discernment helps you differentiate between genuine support and subtle auditing. And when you begin to recognize this pattern, you stop second-guessing yourself. You stop labeling your intuition as insecurity. You start honoring the signal. The enemy monitors silently because they are hoping you will doubt your own perception. They want you to override your spiritual antenna with logic that minimizes what you sensed. But your discernment is not fragile. It is precise. It activates when something is misaligned. And the fact that you felt it means it is working. So instead of apologizing internally for your awareness, embrace it. Instead of shrinking your perception to make others comfortable, strengthen it through prayer and reflection. Spiritual surveillance loses power when it is identified. And you do not defeat it with confrontation. You defeat it with composure. The more centered you become, the less information you unintentionally broadcast. The less reactive you are, the less they can measure. Your stillness becomes your shield. Your restraint becomes your strategy. And the emotional tightening that once confused you becomes confirmation that your spirit is awake. You are not imagining what you sensed. You are evolving into someone who can detect subtle shifts before they escalate. That is not weakness. That is preparation. Because the higher you rise, the more refined your awareness must become. And in this season, you are learning that not every battle is loud, not every threat is obvious, and not every smile is safe. But you are also learning that you do not need to panic to protect yourself. You need clarity. You need composure. You need trust in the spirit that is guiding you from within. And as you embrace that discernment without fear, you step into a level of spiritual intelligence that cannot be easily infiltrated. To fully understand what you are experiencing, you must see that this pattern is not new, not modern, not unique to your timeline, because Scripture has already documented the strategy of monitoring spirits long before you ever felt that tightening in your chest. When Nehemiah began rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, he was not launching an attack. He was restoring something broken. He was doing a work of healing reconstruction and divine assignment. Yet the moment progress became visible, attention followed. His enemies did not initially rush in with swords or physical violence. They stood at a distance. They observed. They mocked. They commented from the sidelines. They said that even a fox climbing on the wall would cause it to collapse. Understand the subtlety of that strategy. They were not trying to physically destroy the wall at first. They were trying to plant seeds of doubt in the builder. They were attempting to weaken confidence before they ever attempted confrontation. This is the essence of psychological warfare. It is easier to collapse a vision from within than to destroy it from the outside. And chosen one, you are in a rebuilding season. You are restoring boundaries. You are reconstructing identity. You are strengthening areas of your life that were once broken or compromised. So of course, surveillance increases, because when walls go up, access becomes limited, and those who once benefited from your vulnerability will naturally respond to your reconstruction with discomfort. Notice that Nehemiah's enemies monitored the process. They watched how quickly the wall was rising. They measured the speed of progress. They listened for discouragement. They waited for fatigue. Monitoring spirits are rarely impulsive. They are patient. They understand that exhaustion creates openings. That is why the mockery came consistently. It was not a one-time insult. It was repetitive commentary designed to wear down resolve. They hoped that if they kept speaking negativity long enough, Nehemiah would internalize it. Because once the builder begins doubting the structure, the wall becomes fragile without a single stone being touched. The strategy was simple but calculated. Provoke a reaction. Trigger emotion. Create oversharing. If Nehemiah had responded defensively, if he had paused construction to argue, if he had announced every stage of progress in an attempt to prove them wrong, he would have slowed the very work he was assigned to complete. Monitoring spirits study reactions more than actions. They want to see how you respond under pressure. They want to know whether you can continue building while commentary floats around you. They measure your composure. They analyze your speech. They wait for you to leak your blueprint through frustration. And here is the deeper layer that many miss. Surveillance often waits for emotional weakness rather than creating immediate confrontation. It studies your tired days. It tracks your stressful moments. It pays attention when you are disappointed or lonely or overwhelmed. Because when emotion rises, unchecked discernment can blur. You might reveal more than you intended. You might vent your strategy to someone who is not aligned. You might question your calling out loud. And that verbalized doubt becomes information. In Nehemiah's story, the enemies eventually escalated their tactics, but only after they realized that mockery alone was not stopping the work. The initial phase was observation and psychological pressure. That is why resilience is tested in quiet ways first. Before any major attack, there is usually a season of commentary, of subtle probing, of sideways glances and indirect questions. And your response in that season determines whether escalation happens. When you remain focused, when you do not react to every whisper, when you continue laying brick after brick of discipline, healing, and growth, surveillance begins to lose its effectiveness. Because the purpose of monitoring is to interrupt momentum. If your momentum continues uninterrupted, the watcher becomes frustrated. But do not misunderstand this as a call to harden your heart or become combative. Nehemiah did not descend into paranoia. He did not abandon wisdom. He posted guards when necessary, yes, but he kept building. That balance is powerful. Awareness without panic. Preparation without obsession. Progress without announcement. The enemies were watching, but heaven was also watching. And the resilience Nehemiah displayed became testimony. Surveillance in Scripture was never only about the enemy trying to stop progress. It was also about God observing faithfulness under pressure. Your resilience in being watched is part of your promotion. Can you keep rebuilding while someone doubts you? Can you stay disciplined while someone studies you for flaws? Can you resist the urge to prove yourself prematurely? Monitoring spirits rely on emotional leakage. They rely on the human need to be understood, validated, defended. But spiritual maturity learns when to speak and when to remain silent. The strategy of waiting for emotional weakness is ancient. Think about how often discouragement attempts to visit late at night, when you are tired, when you are replaying conversations in your mind. Surveillance whispers maybe they are right. Maybe this wall will fall. Maybe you are not as strong as you think. But resilience answers differently. It says, I will keep building anyway. I will not let commentary become construction material in my mind. I will not internalize doubt that was never mine. And here is the transformative truth. Surveillance, when endured, correctly strengthens you. It sharpens discipline. It forces you to guard your words. It refines your emotional regulation. It teaches you to draw strength from God rather than from applause. In that sense, surveillance becomes a test of resilience rather than a threat to your destiny. Nehemiah's wall did not fall because foxes were mentioned. It stood because the builder refused to descend into distraction. And you must see your current season through that lens. The observation around you is not evidence of impending collapse. It is evidence that something worth watching is rising. Psychological warfare loses when the mind is anchored. Mockery loses when identity is secure. Monitoring loses when momentum is steady. So instead of viewing surveillance as intimidation, view it as confirmation that your rebuilding matters. You are not randomly being observed. You are being measured because growth is visible. And resilience in this season is not about shouting back. It is about continuing forward. The wall rises stone by stone, discipline by discipline, prayer by prayer. And the watchers eventually realize that their commentary cannot dismantle what heaven instructed you to build. Just when you begin to grasp the reality that the enemy has been watching, measuring, and waiting for a fracture in your focus, the deeper revelation unfolds and shifts the entire atmosphere of this season. Because the surveillance you feel is not one-dimensional, it is dual. Yes, the enemy has been observing, but heaven has also been watching, and that changes everything. The twist in this narrative is not meant to intensify your anxiety, but to elevate your awareness. You are not caught in a dark alley with unseen eyes lurking in the shadows. You are standing in a courtroom where multiple witnesses are present. Scripture in Hebrews 12:1 declares that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, and most read that phrase casually, imagining distant figures passively observing from some spiritual balcony. But the original Greek word used there is martis, and martis is not a casual spectator. A martis is a legal witness. A martis testifies. A martis gives sworn evidence based on what they have seen. This is not stadium imagery. This is judicial imagery. Your life is being evaluated in a courtroom context. Every reaction, every restraint, every moment of silence under pressure is being recorded as testimony. And this is where your understanding must mature. The enemy watches to accuse, to exploit, to gather evidence for downfall. Heaven watches to affirm, to validate, to prepare evidence for promotion. The same moment of pressure can serve two very different purposes, depending on who is observing it. When you feel watched and misunderstood, you might assume you are under attack alone, but in reality, you are under evaluation for advancement. Heaven does not allow pressure randomly. Pressure is allowed because it reveals composition. It reveals depth. It reveals whether your growth is external performance or internal transformation. If there were no surveillance, there would be no testimony. If there were no observation, there would be no recorded evidence of maturity. Think about a courtroom. A verdict is not declared without witnesses presenting what they have observed. The cloud of witnesses is not cheering blindly. They are documenting your resilience. They are noting how you responded when mocked. They are observing whether you guarded your tongue when provoked. They are testifying that you remained faithful when misunderstood. That is why this season feels intense. You are under dual lenses. The enemy's lens looks for weakness. Heaven's lens looks for readiness. And pressure becomes the stage where both lenses operate simultaneously. When you internalize this truth, fear loses its grip. Because you realize that you are not simply being targeted, you are being considered. You are not simply under attack. You are under review. The courtroom imagery reframes your entire perspective. Life is not random chaos. It is structured evaluation. Every trial, every moment of restraint, every decision not to retaliate becomes legal evidence that you are ready for greater authority. Pressure allowed is not cruelty. It is confirmation that you are strong enough to handle scrutiny. No one audits what has no value. No one monitors what carries no potential. The very fact that your reactions are being tested means that your future assignment carries weight. Heaven does not promote immaturity. Heaven promotes those who can remain composed under observation. And that becomes the core question of this section. Can you remain composed when you know you are being watched? Can you continue building without performing for the audience? Can you stay silent without needing validation? This is not about suppressing emotion. It is about mastering it. When someone misinterprets your silence, can you resist the urge to over-explain? When someone questions your growth, can you resist the urge to prove it? Because every time you choose composure over reaction, the witnesses record maturity. The enemy hopes pressure will create emotional leakage. Heaven hopes pressure will reveal stability. And your choice determines which narrative becomes stronger. The spiritual courtroom is active in this season. Your life is evidence. Your discipline is evidence. Your refusal to retaliate is evidence. Your decision to continue forward without announcement is evidence. And here is the empowering truth. The enemy cannot tamper with heaven's records. They can watch, but they cannot rewrite what is documented in your favor. They can observe, but they cannot alter the testimony of your restraint. So instead of shrinking under the weight of being watched, you rise into composure. Instead of becoming hyper-reactive, you become intentional. Instead of panicking about who is monitoring you, you remember who is validating you. The courtroom dynamic transforms your posture. You no longer feel hunted. You feel examined for promotion. You no longer feel isolated. You feel accompanied by witnesses who understand your journey. Pressure becomes evidence of maturity. Scrutiny becomes preparation for authority. And composure becomes your most powerful testimony. Because when the verdict of promotion is finally declared, it will not be based on potential alone. It will be based on observed resilience. So hold your posture. Guard your frequency. Let your silence speak louder than your defense. Because both lenses are active, but only one holds the final authority. And as you remain steady under dual surveillance, you step closer to a verdict that shifts your entire destiny. Now that you understand the dual surveillance surrounding this season, you must step deeper into the mechanics of the battlefield itself, because what is being watched is not only your actions, but your frequency. The true arena of this warfare is not physical space. It is neurological and spiritual alignment. Stress and fear are not merely emotions. They are measurable states of brain activity. When you are anxious, when you are replaying conversations at midnight, when your heart races because you feel misunderstood or targeted, your brain shifts into what science calls beta frequency. Beta is the state of heightened alertness. It is the frequency of survival mode. It is the rhythm of fight or flight. In beta, your mind scans for threats. Your body prepares for defense. Your muscles tighten. Your breathing shortens. Your thoughts accelerate. This state was designed for short bursts of protection, not prolonged habitation. But the modern world, with its constant notifications, economic pressures, relational tensions, and subtle social comparisons, keeps you locked in beta far longer than intended. And here is the spiritual implication that most overlook. When you live in sustained stress, you become easier to read. Your reactions become predictable. Your triggers become visible. Beta broadcasts. It emits a signal of urgency, vulnerability, and emotional exposure. The enemy's radar is tuned precisely to that signal, not because they are omniscient, but because stress creates patterns. When you are in panic, you over-explain. When you are in fear, you overshare. When you are in insecurity, you seek validation from the very spaces that monitor you. Beta frequency lights up your nervous system like a flare in the night sky. It makes your energy easier to interpret, easier to provoke, easier to intercept. That is why fear is not just uncomfortable, it is strategic vulnerability. This does not mean you are weak for feeling it. It means you must understand its mechanics. The enemy does not need to physically approach you if they can keep you mentally activated in survival mode. As long as you are tense, as long as you are reactive, as long as your thoughts are racing, your internal broadcast remains accessible. But there is another state, another rhythm, another level of neurological and spiritual alignment that shifts the entire battlefield. This state is known as theta frequency. Theta is slower, deeper, more expansive. It is the brainwave pattern often associated with deep meditation, creativity, healing, and subconscious integration. But spiritually, theta represents something even more profound. It is the frequency of surrender. It is the state where the nervous system relaxes, where breathing slows, where awareness expands beyond immediate threat. In theta, you are not reacting, you are receiving. You are not defending, you are discerning. You are not broadcasting panic, you are resting in authority. When Scripture speaks of being still and knowing, it is describing a shift into this deeper alignment. Theta is not passivity, it is regulated power. It is composure under pressure. It is calm in the presence of surveillance. And here is the powerful truth. The enemy's radar struggles to track theta. Because theta does not emit chaotic signals. It does not leak anxiety. It does not fluctuate wildly based on commentary. Theta is stable, grounded, anchored. When you operate from this state, you become less predictable. Your reactions are delayed, thoughtful, intentional. Your words are measured. Your energy is contained. In many ways, theta functions like a cloak. Not because you disappear physically, but because your internal broadcast becomes quiet. Imagine trying to detect a signal that is no longer spiking erratically, but resting in steady rhythm. Surveillance loses traction. Provocation loses reward. Monitoring becomes frustrating because there is no emotional spike to analyze. This is why spiritual maturity involves nervous system regulation. You cannot fight frequency warfare with louder emotion. You cannot defeat monitoring spirits by reacting faster. You shift the battlefield by lowering your internal turbulence. When you feel stress rising instead of indulging it, you breathe into stillness. When you feel the urge to defend yourself immediately, you pause. When you sense fear attempting to grip your chest, you release your shoulders and slow your breath. These are not small acts, they are frequency adjustments, and over time they retrain your system. Beta is not evil, it is necessary for survival. But living in constant beta keeps you visible in ways you do not realize. Theta restores invisibility through composure. In theta, creativity flows, insight increases, divine instruction becomes clearer. You begin to perceive solutions rather than threats. Your mind stops rehearsing worst-case scenarios and starts receiving clarity. And here is the most empowering layer. When you operate in theta, you do not become passive toward injustice. You become strategic. You do not ignore danger. You observe it without panic. You do not collapse under scrutiny. You stabilize within it. That stabilization is what makes you difficult to track emotionally. The enemy can anticipate anger. The enemy can anticipate insecurity. But they struggle to anticipate regulated peace. And peace in this context is not naivete. It is disciplined alignment. It is choosing not to let commentary dictate your internal rhythm. It is refusing to allow stress to hijack your broadcast. Frequency warfare is subtle but real. Every thought you dwell on either amplifies beta or strengthens theta. Every breath you regulate either escalates panic or anchors peace. Every decision to remain composed under pressure recalibrates your system. And as you practice this alignment, you will notice something remarkable. The need to prove yourself decreases. The urgency to respond instantly fades. The internal chatter quiets. You become less readable to those who seek to provoke you, and more receptive to the voice that guides you. Theta becomes your invisibility cloak, not because you vanish, but because your stability makes you uninteresting to those who feed on reaction. When there is no emotional spike to exploit, surveillance grows bored. And when your internal world is anchored in stillness, divine direction becomes sharper. So the battlefield shifts from external confrontation to internal calibration. You win not by shouting louder, but by slowing deeper. You gain advantage not by reacting faster, but by resting stronger. And as you embrace this divine state, you realize that the greatest weapon in this season is not aggression, but alignment. Now that you understand the mechanics of frequency warfare, you must realize that the instruction to shift into stillness is not poetic advice or passive spirituality. It is spiritual technology. When Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God," it is not offering a decorative phrase for peaceful moments. It is issuing a command that alters the battlefield entirely. The Hebrew word used there is rapha, and rapha does not simply mean sit quietly or reduce noise. Rapha means to let go, to release, to drop your grip. It carries the imagery of hands unclenching of weapons, falling from tightened fists of a body stepping out of combat posture. It is a directive to disengage from survival mode at a physical and spiritual level. And this is where the instruction becomes profound. Because most of your stress in this season is not coming from visible confrontation. It is coming from internal bracing. You have been clenching emotionally, preparing for impact that has not yet arrived. You have been mentally rehearsing defense strategies, guarding yourself against criticism, tightening your posture in anticipation of misunderstanding. Rapha calls you to drop that posture. It calls you to release the invisible weapons you have been gripping. And that is difficult, because survival mode feels productive. Clenching feels like preparation. Overthinking feels like protection. But prolonged bracing exhausts the system. Your nervous system was not designed to remain in combat readiness indefinitely. When Scripture commands stillness, it is commanding nervous system regulation before the language of neuroscience ever existed. To be still in the biblical sense is to surrender control of the battle to God rather than attempting to micromanage every possible threat. And here is where many resist. Because surrender feels vulnerable. Letting go feels unsafe. Dropping the weapons feels like exposure. But Rapha is not about abandoning wisdom. It is about releasing hypervigilance. It is about trusting that you do not need to anticipate every attack in order to survive it. When you physically release tension in your shoulders, when you slow your breath intentionally, when you allow your jaw to unclench and your hands to rest, you are not just calming down. You are signaling to your brain that the war posture can deactivate. And that deactivation is not weakness. It is strength under authority. Modern systems are engineered to keep you from Rapha. Notifications interrupt your stillness. Social media feeds trigger comparison and urgency. News cycles amplify fear. Economic pressures whisper scarcity. Toxic dynamics demand immediate responses. The entire structure of the world thrives on keeping you slightly activated, slightly anxious, slightly braced. Because a braced mind is reactive. A reactive mind is predictable, and a predictable mind is easier to influence. Stillness disrupts that pattern. When you enter restorative stillness, you reclaim agency. You slow the pace of reaction. You refuse to let external stimuli dictate internal rhythm. And that refusal is warfare. Because when you drop your survival weapons, you create space for divine strategy. In Rafa, clarity returns. Insight sharpens. Your perception widens beyond immediate threat. You begin to see patterns rather than isolated incidents. You respond instead of react. The battlefield shifts from chaotic scrambling to intentional movement. And this is why stillness must be practiced, not assumed. You cannot drift into Rafa accidentally while constantly scrolling or replaying arguments in your mind. You must choose it. You must deliberately step out of the stress loop. You must intentionally quiet the narrative that insists everything depends on your constant vigilance. Because the truth is, some battles are won not by striking harder, but by standing grounded. Releasing tension physically is a gateway to releasing tension spiritually. When you soften your body, you soften your internal broadcast. When you breathe slowly, you lower beta activation and invite theta alignment. When you close your eyes and surrender control, you step out of the enemy's reactive radar and into divine oversight. Rafa is not inactivity. It is trust embodied. It is saying, I do not need to grip this outcome. I do not need to defend myself prematurely. I do not need to broadcast my anxiety to prove my awareness. I can release. And in releasing, I become stronger. The modern stress loop convinces you that if you stop bracing, everything will collapse. But Scripture teaches the opposite. When you are still, God is exalted. When you release, He moves. When you drop the weapons of self-defense, He becomes your defense. This is not mystical fantasy, it is practical alignment. When you stop responding instantly to every message, you create strategic silence. When you refuse to explain yourself unnecessarily, you preserve energy. When you choose to rest rather than rehearse worst-case scenarios, you reset your nervous system. Entering restorative stillness becomes an offensive move. It disorients monitoring spirits because they expect agitation. They expect reaction. They expect visible stress. When they encounter calm, they encounter a closed loop. There is nothing to feed on, nothing to escalate. Stillness becomes your camouflage, not because you hide physically, but because your internal state no longer emits urgency, and urgency is what surveillance tracks. Rafa then is both surrender and shield. It is letting go of clenched control and stepping into anchored authority. It is acknowledging that you are not required to fight every battle personally. It is trusting that composure is more powerful than overexertion. And as you practice this technology of stillness, you will notice your resilience increase. Your mind will stop spiraling as quickly. Your body will recover faster from stress. Your words will become fewer but more precise. The battlefield will feel less chaotic because you are no longer participating in frantic frequency. Stillness does not eliminate surveillance. It renders it ineffective. Because the watcher can only provoke what is already activated. And when you are anchored in Rafa, there is nothing unstable to exploit. So drop the invisible weapons. Release the clenched posture. Breathe deeply and intentionally. Allow your nervous system to settle. Not as escapism, but as strategy. Because in this season, your greatest advantage is not louder defense. It is disciplined stillness. As you begin to practice stillness and understand Rafa not as passivity but as disciplined release, another layer of practical alignment becomes available to you because spiritual growth is not meant to float in abstraction. It must integrate with the design of your brain and nervous system. The battlefield of frequency warfare is not won by intention alone. It is strengthened by repetition and recalibration. This is where the concept of neural entrainment enters as a tool rather than a novelty. Brainwave entrainment is not mystical exaggeration. It is the principle that the brain naturally synchronizes to rhythmic stimuli. Just as your heartbeat can slow in response to steady breathing, your brainwaves can gradually align with consistent auditory patterns. This is not manipulation. It is resonance. Your mind responds to rhythm. And in a world saturated with chaotic inputs, deliberate rhythm becomes a corrective force. When you expose your nervous system to certain steady frequencies, your brain can begin to transition from heightened beta activation into deeper theta alignment without the strain of forcing silence through sheer willpower. Consider how a tuning fork works. Strike one tuning fork, and another nearby fork of the same frequency begins to vibrate in response. It does not struggle. It does not argue. It resonates. In the same way, when your mind is exposed to carefully designed rhythmic audio, your neural activity gradually entrains meaning. It begins to mirror that rhythm. The 7-minute recalibration method is powerful not because of complexity, but because of consistency. 7 minutes is short enough to remove excuses and long enough to influence neural patterns. When practiced daily, this brief window of structured auditory stillness becomes a doorway. You are not escaping reality. You are resetting your internal broadcast. Imagine beginning each morning not by scrolling through stress-inducing headlines, but by allowing your brain to stabilize into slower, coherent patterns. Within minutes, your breathing deepens, your shoulders soften, your internal chatter decreases. This is not magic. It is physiology aligning with rhythm. And when physiology aligns, discernment sharpens. The sacredness of this tool lies not in superstition, but in stewardship. You are stewarding your nervous system. You are intentionally guiding your brain away from survival loops and into restorative states. When you shift from beta into theta through rhythmic entrainment, something subtle but significant occurs. Your internal reactivity decreases. Emotional spikes flatten. Insight begins to surface from beneath the noise. Theta is associated with creativity, intuition, and integration. In theta, your subconscious and conscious mind communicate more fluidly. Spiritually, this feels like clarity, like downloads, like gentle instruction rising without strain. This is why the tool is not a replacement for prayer or faith. It is an alignment device that quiets interference. You are not summoning power from an external source. You are clearing static so that divine direction can be heard more clearly. And that distinction is essential, because the moment a tool is elevated above alignment, it becomes superstition. But when a tool is understood as support for discipline, it becomes powerful. 7 minutes each day becomes a neural ritual, a deliberate act of recalibration. Over time, your baseline state begins to shift. You recover from stress faster. You resist provocation more easily. You pause before reacting. Surveillance loses traction because your nervous system is no longer oscillating wildly. This is restoration of capacity that was suppressed by constant stimulation. Most people live in chronic beta without realizing it. Notifications fragment attention. Multitasking splits focus. Conversations overlap with digital noise. The brain never fully descends into restorative depth. And when that depth is inaccessible, spiritual capacity feels distant. It is not that the spirit has withdrawn. It is that the noise is too loud. Neural recalibration lowers the volume of internal chaos. It invites integration. It reminds your system how to rest deeply, even in short intervals. And as this becomes habitual, something remarkable happens. Your discernment no longer feels fragile. Your composure no longer feels forced. Your silence no longer feels tense. You begin to operate from anchored calm rather than reactive vigilance. The enemy's radar is tuned to spikes, to emotional turbulence, to stress emissions. When those emissions decrease, their tracking becomes less precise. This is not invisibility through disappearance. It is invisibility through stability. The recalibration method trains your nervous system to remain coherent even under scrutiny. And coherence is power. When your internal rhythm is steady, your words carry more weight. Your decisions are less impulsive. Your boundaries feel natural rather than defensive. This restoration of suppressed spiritual capacity is subtle at first. You might notice that you no longer feel compelled to respond instantly to messages. You might find that criticism does not linger as long in your thoughts. You might sense a deeper reservoir of patience. These are signs of integration. The tool has done its work not by altering your identity, but by removing interference. You were always designed to operate from aligned frequency. Chronic stress simply obscured that design. And as you reclaim neural regulation through disciplined entrainment, you reclaim clarity. It is important to approach this practice without desperation. You are not using it to escape warfare. You are using it to stabilize within it. You are not chasing mystical experiences. You are strengthening your baseline. The sacredness is in consistency. 7 minutes. Daily. Calm repetition. Over weeks and months, this rhythm becomes second nature. You will notice that even without the audio playing, your breathing slows more quickly. Your mind descends into stillness more readily. You carry the rhythm with you, and that is when the tool has fulfilled its purpose. It has trained your system to remember how to rest. Spiritual maturity is not only about resisting temptation or guarding your words. It is also about regulating your nervous system so that your discernment remains sharp and your composure remains intact. Neural recalibration becomes an act of obedience to the command of stillness. It becomes a practical expression of Rafa. You are not surrendering responsibility. You are strengthening resilience. And as your baseline frequency stabilizes, you step further into the kind of invisibility that surveillance cannot penetrate. Not because you are hiding, but because you are no longer broadcasting chaos. As your frequency stabilizes and your nervous system becomes less reactive, another layer of wisdom must be activated because alignment alone is not enough. Strategy must follow stability. This is where what can be called the blind spot protocol begins to take shape. Not as paranoia, not as manipulation, but as disciplined stewardship of what has been entrusted to you. Before we even enter the mechanics of this protocol, you must acknowledge something honestly. There is a part of you that hesitates to rise fully because you fear visibility. You fear that stepping boldly into your calling will paint a target on your back. You fear that greater light will attract greater scrutiny. That fear does not mean your faith is weak. It means you understand weight. It means you recognize that elevation carries responsibility. Immaturity craves spotlight without comprehending consequence. Maturity recognizes that growth changes dynamics. When you rise, patterns shift. When you elevate, access narrows. and some will respond to your growth with curiosity that is not entirely pure. So the fear of becoming a bigger target is not cowardice. It is awareness. And awareness is not something to suppress. It is something to refine. Because the goal is not to dim your light to avoid attention. The goal is to shine wisely. That wisdom is what this protocol cultivates. The blind spot protocol is not about hiding your identity. It is about protecting timing. It is about ensuring that revelation is rooted before exposure. And that begins with the first step, what can be called the 48-hour vault. Whenever breakthrough occurs, whenever you receive a new opportunity, a fresh revelation, a confirmation that shifts your direction, the immediate impulse is often to share, to announce, to celebrate publicly, to seek affirmation. But premature exposure weakens momentum. Seeds require soil before sunlight. If you reveal everything the moment it arrives, you give observers time to analyze, critique, and subtly influence the direction of what has not yet stabilized. The 48-hour vault is simple but powerful. When something significant happens, you lock it internally for 2 full days. You do not post about it. You do not broadcast it. You do not even over-discuss it with those who are not directly involved. You let it settle. You allow it to anchor within you. In that silence, the breakthrough integrates. It roots. It strengthens. By the time it becomes visible, it is no longer fragile. This discipline alone eliminates a large portion of surveillance interference, because what cannot be seen cannot be targeted prematurely. The vault is not secrecy rooted in fear. It is patience rooted in wisdom. It is giving heaven space to solidify what it initiated before external commentary attempts to shape it. And as you practice this, you will notice something surprising. The urge to announce diminishes. The satisfaction of quiet progress increases. You begin to value stability over applause. But silence alone is not enough, because monitoring does not always retreat when information is withheld. Sometimes curiosity intensifies. That is why the second step of the blind spot protocol becomes necessary. Decoy conversations are not deception in a sinful sense. They are redirection. When probing questions arise, when someone attempts to extract details about your next move, your finances, your relationships, your plans, you respond with grace but not with disclosure. You offer something harmless and mundane. You speak about the weather, a routine task, a neutral update. You give enough to satisfy surface curiosity without unveiling the blueprint. This requires emotional discipline, because often the desire to be understood tempts you to reveal more than is necessary. But understanding must be earned through alignment, not granted through pressure. A decoy conversation protects sacred vision from premature evaluation. It is not about lying. It is about selective transparency. Not everyone is entitled to full access to what God is building in you, and learning that boundary is maturity. Scripture supports this balance clearly when Jesus instructed his disciples to be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. That phrase holds profound depth. Innocent as doves means your motives remain pure. You are not retaliating. You are not manipulating. You are not harboring malice. Your heart stays clean. But shrewd as snakes means you move wisely. A snake does not announce its direction. It glides. It conserves energy. It chooses its timing. It observes before striking. Shrewdness is not wickedness. It is awareness applied with restraint. When you combine innocence with shrewdness, you operate from a place of strategic peace. You are kind, but not naive. You are open, but not exposed. You are gracious, but not gullible. The blind spot protocol is not about living suspiciously. It is about living intentionally. When you understand that growth attracts attention, you prepare accordingly. You do not shrink your ambition. You refine your communication. You do not withdraw from connection. You deepen discernment. And this balanced posture disorients surveillance, because those who expect emotional reactions encounter composure. Those who expect oversharing encounter restraint. Those who expect impulsive announcements encounter patience. Over time, monitoring loses interest when there is no visible leakage. And here is the empowering truth. The protocol does not limit your destiny. It accelerates it. Because what is rooted quietly grows stronger. What is guarded matures fully. What is revealed at the right time carries authority. Your fear of becoming a bigger target transforms into confidence in becoming a wiser steward. You do not hide your light. You manage its exposure. You do not deny your calling. You protect its development. And as you embody both innocence and shrewdness, you step into a level of spiritual intelligence that is difficult to penetrate. Surveillance cannot disrupt what it cannot read. And the blind spot protocol ensures that your internal blueprint remains invisible until it is strong enough to stand publicly without collapse. So rise without apology, but rise with wisdom. Speak with kindness, but speak selectively. Move forward boldly, but reveal strategically. Because in this season, maturity is not only measured by how brightly you shine, but by how wisely you manage that light. As you implement the blind spot protocol and stabilize your frequency, do not be surprised if subtle countermeasures emerge almost immediately, because growth shifts dynamics, and dynamics trigger reconnaissance. In the next stretch of days, you may notice 3 distinct patterns surface, not dramatically, not violently, but strategically. These are not random interactions. They are tests of your new boundaries. The first is what can be called the phony check-in. It will appear harmless, a message out of the blue from someone who has been silent for months. A casual, just thinking about you, followed by a very specific question about your progress, your plans, your finances, or a recent opportunity. The tone will sound warm. The wording will feel neutral. But beneath the surface, the question will be precise. It will aim to measure whether you are still struggling or stepping forward. It is reconnaissance disguised as care. The purpose is not always malicious in a dramatic sense, but it is probing. It seeks updates. It seeks leverage. It seeks to see whether your walls are rising or crumbling. And this is where your composure becomes your protection. You do not confront. You do not accuse. You do not over-explain. You respond with grace. You remain warm, but you keep the answer general. You offer enough to satisfy courtesy without exposing trajectory. Emotional discipline in this moment is powerful, because the impulse to justify, to clarify, or to prove progress can pull you into oversharing. But remember, what is rooted quietly grows stronger. The second reconnaissance mission is subtler and often more personal. It can be called the dream interceptor. This one rarely comes through obvious opposition. It often arrives through someone close, a friend, a relative, a colleague who presents their words as concern. They will encourage practicality. They will suggest lowering expectations. They will frame their caution as realism. On the surface, it sounds wise. They might say, "Just be careful," or "Don't get your hopes up too high," or "Maybe you should think smaller for now." The tone may even be protective, but beneath that tone is a subtle pull toward contraction. The Dream Interceptor attempts to pull your frequency back down to the comfort zone of survival. It attempts to reduce your expansion to something manageable and less threatening. And the challenge here is not to become defensive. You do not argue your calling. You do not debate your vision. You do not try to convert their perspective. You listen. You thank them for their input. And internally, you filter. Not every caution is sabotage, but not every caution is alignment. Discernment becomes essential. You weigh words quietly. You discard what diminishes your conviction. You retain what strengthens wisdom. And you move forward without resentment. Because reacting emotionally would create exactly the turbulence surveillance seeks. The third reconnaissance mission is perhaps the most emotionally charged. It can be called the isolation guilt trip. As you refine your boundaries and reduce oversharing, some will notice that you are less available, less reactive, less entangled, and that change may be interpreted as distance. You might hear comments like, "You've changed," or "You don't talk like you used to," or "You think you're better than us now." The implication is subtle but sharp. The attempt is to make you feel guilty for evolving. It is designed to trigger a return to familiarity. If guilt succeeds, you may begin apologizing for growth. You may begin shrinking your language, softening your confidence, or reopening access that you intentionally closed. But here is the truth you must internalize deeply. Growth is not betrayal. Elevation is not arrogance. Boundaries are not rejection. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to mature. You are allowed to protect your energy. The isolation guilt trip tests whether you value approval more than alignment, and your response determines whether your evolution stabilizes or regresses. The strategic response to all three missions remains consistent. Grace, vagueness, emotional discipline. Grace ensures your heart remains clean. You do not harbor bitterness. You do not weaponize silence. Vagueness protects your blueprint. You answer without revealing. You speak without exposing. Emotional discipline anchors your frequency. You do not allow tone to spike. You do not escalate conversations unnecessarily. You remain centered. And perhaps most importantly, you refuse to apologize for growth. This refusal is not loud. It is internal. It is a quiet decision that says, "I will not shrink to make others comfortable. I will not dim my clarity to maintain outdated dynamics. I will not abandon alignment for the sake of approval." When you respond this way, something powerful happens. Surveillance becomes confused. The phony check-in yields little data. The Dream Interceptor receives no argument to manipulate. The isolation guilt trip finds no emotional crack to exploit. Over time, reconnaissance loses momentum because there is no visible reaction to analyze. And this is not about isolating yourself from community. It is about refining community. Those who are aligned will respect your boundaries. They will celebrate your growth without probing for details. They will encourage your vision without shrinking it. And those who cannot adjust will naturally drift. That drift is not tragedy. It is transition. The next 7 days are not about anticipating attacks with fear. They are about observing patterns with awareness. You are not entering combat. You are entering composure. Each reconnaissance mission is simply an opportunity to practice what you have learned, to remain steady, to guard your frequency, to choose response over reaction. And as you navigate these interactions with calm confidence, you will feel a shift. The pressure to defend yourself decreases. The urge to explain dissolves. The need for external validation weakens. In its place, a quiet authority emerges. You move with less noise. You speak with more precision. You engage without exposure. And through it all, you stand firmly in the truth that growth requires adjustment. Not everyone will understand your evolution. Not everyone is meant to, but you are not responsible for preserving comfort at the expense of calling. You are responsible for stewarding what has been entrusted to you. And as you pass these reconnaissance tests with grace and discipline, you will realize that the greatest victory is not silencing watchers. It is stabilizing yourself so completely that their watching becomes irrelevant. To ground everything you have learned in lived reality, consider a real-world scenario that mirrors exactly what you are navigating, because principles are powerful, but testimony cements conviction. There was a chosen one working inside a competitive corporate environment where subtle surveillance was constant. Ideas were casually borrowed and later presented by others as their own. Promotions seemed to stall mysteriously whenever momentum began to build. Conversations in hallways shifted tone when they walked into the room. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic, just enough to create internal tension. At first, the response was natural. Beta frequency activated. Overthinking increased. Emails were reread multiple times before sending. Defensive explanations were added unnecessarily to proposals. There was a constant urge to clarify intentions and prove competence. And the more reactive the chosen one became internally, the more visible the stress signals were externally. Surveillance fed on that tension. Colleagues could sense the anxiety. Subtle provocations increased. It felt like being watched from every angle. But then the shift happened. Instead of fighting harder, instead of confronting prematurely, this chosen one committed to daily theta recalibration. Every morning before opening email, before checking notifications, 7 minutes of rhythmic stillness. Breathing slowed. Shoulders softened. Internal narrative quieted. Over days and weeks, something remarkable occurred. The urge to defend dissolved. The impulse to overshare decreased. Responses became shorter, clearer, more measured. Instead of reacting immediately to subtle jabs, there was pause. Instead of clarifying every detail of upcoming projects, information was released selectively. Emotional spikes flattened. Surveillance began to lose traction because there was nothing dramatic to analyze. The chosen one stopped broadcasting stress. And when stress disappeared, the perceived threat of advancement appeared to shrink in the eyes of adversaries. They misread composure as passivity. They assumed ambition had cooled. They reduced their monitoring because the reaction they were waiting for never came. Strategic silence created confusion. When meetings occurred, this chosen one spoke concisely and left space rather than over-explaining. When asked probing questions about long-term plans, answers remained general and calm. Internally, the blind spot protocol was active. Breakthrough opportunities were placed in the 48-hour vault before being discussed. Decoy conversations redirected curiosity. And most importantly, reactive behavior was eliminated. No more visible frustration. No more defensive emails. No more venting in open channels. The frequency shifted entirely. Surveillance depends on feedback loops. When adversaries push and receive visible reaction, the loop continues. When they push and encounter neutrality, the loop collapses. Over time, monitoring decreased because there was nothing to track. And in that space of reduced attention, something strategic unfolded. Instead of competing within the department where scrutiny was highest, The chosen one quietly networked with higher-level executives in other divisions. Conversations were intentional and private. Proposals were refined without announcement. Because the emotional charge had been removed, discernment sharpened. Timing became clearer. And then, without warning to those who once monitored closely, a contract was secured directly with leadership outside the previous chain of command. It was announced formally through official channels before anyone who had been watching could intercept it. The breakthrough was not loud. It was not accompanied by dramatic confrontation. It was steady, silent, undeniable. And the most powerful part was this. By the time adversaries realized what had happened, the position was already solidified. The opportunity was already signed. The advancement was already established. Surveillance had been bypassed not through aggression, but through invisibility. This case study reveals something crucial. Winning through invisibility does not mean shrinking your ambition. It means stabilizing your internal state so thoroughly that others miscalculate your trajectory. It means eliminating reactive behavior so completely that adversaries underestimate you. It means applying theta alignment daily until composure becomes default rather than effort. Strategic silence is not weakness, it is leverage. When you stop explaining every move, you conserve energy for execution. When you stop reacting emotionally, you disrupt monitoring patterns. When you guard breakthroughs quietly, you prevent premature interference. And then, when the door opens, it opens without resistance, because the groundwork was laid without noise. This is not manipulation. It is maturity. It is stewardship of timing. It is alignment between internal regulation and external strategy. The workplace example simply mirrors what is possible in any environment where growth attracts observation. You do not need to announce your evolution. You do not need to confront every watcher. You stabilize. You refine. You execute quietly. And when the result manifests, it speaks louder than reaction ever could. Breakthrough achieved quietly often lasts longer than breakthrough achieved through confrontation, because it is rooted in discipline, not drama. And as you absorb this example, understand that invisibility is not about disappearing. It is about becoming so internally regulated and strategically reserved that surveillance becomes irrelevant. You are not hiding from opportunity. You are positioning yourself beyond interference. And when your advancement finally becomes visible, it will not feel like luck. It will feel like alignment that was cultivated patiently beneath the surface. Now everything shifts from instruction to activation, because knowledge without embodiment leaves potential unrealized, and you were not brought this far simply to understand strategy intellectually. You were brought here to step into it. What began as a teaching now becomes a ceiling. You have learned about surveillance, about frequency, about RAFA, about neural recalibration, about the blind spot protocol and strategic silence. But this moment is not about information. It is about alignment becoming covenant. Imagine the spiritual courtroom once more, not as a place of anxiety, but as a place of declaration. The witnesses have observed your restraint. They have recorded your composure. They have noted your refusal to retaliate prematurely. And now the atmosphere shifts from observation to authorization. This sealing ceremony is not theatrical. It is internal. It is the moment you decide that what you have learned will become how you live. In the courtroom of heaven, declarations carry weight. So right now, in your own stillness, let this be framed as a declaration. Father God, you have seen every moment of silent endurance. You have seen every tightening of the chest that did not turn into reaction. You have seen every opportunity to overshare that was resisted. You have seen every time this chosen one chose composure over chaos. And on that evidence, a sealing takes place. The blind spot protocol is not just a concept. It is embedded into the neural pathways. The 48-hour vault becomes instinct. Decoy conversations become natural. Discernment sharpens without paranoia. Frequency stabilizes without strain. This is not about fighting monitoring spirits directly. It is about rendering them ineffective. So let there be a command in the spiritual realm, not shouted, not dramatic, but authoritative. Every monitoring spirit assigned to track stress signals, to provoke reaction, to intercept premature exposure, is now confronted with stillness. Their radar meets calm. Their provocation meets restraint. Their curiosity meets vagueness. And in that encounter, confusion replaces clarity. They look and they see nothing unstable to exploit. They listen and they hear nothing reactive to amplify. They probe and they receive no blueprint to intercept. This is what spiritual cloaking looks like. Not invisibility through disappearance, but invisibility through regulation. Not hiding from destiny, but stabilizing into it. And from this posture, a decree can be spoken, quietly yet firmly. Promotion will come silently. Doors will open without announcement. Breakthrough will manifest without drama. What once felt like pressure becomes preparation. What once felt like surveillance becomes stage. What once felt like vulnerability becomes advantage. Silent promotion is not lesser promotion. It is deeper. It bypasses sabotage because it is rooted before it is revealed. Stealth breakthrough does not require applause. It requires alignment. And you are aligned. But sealing requires consent. So now the final question is not directed outward. It is directed inward. Will you guard your frequency? Will you hold your silence when provoked? Will you resist the urge to prove and instead trust the process of rooting? Will you remain in Rafa when stress attempts to rise? This is not a casual yes. This is covenant. Because the moment you say yes internally, you are agreeing to discipline. You are agreeing to daily recalibration. You are agreeing to selective transparency. You are agreeing to composure under dual surveillance. Let that yes rise quietly within you, not forced, not emotional, but steady. Yes, I will guard my frequency. Yes, I will manage my words. Yes, I will move strategically. Yes, I will trust silent growth over loud validation. That internal yes is recorded. It marks a transition from awareness to embodiment. And now, before anything else is said, allow holy stillness to settle. Not as emptiness, but as presence. Feel your breathing slow. Feel your shoulders release. Feel your jaw soften. This stillness is not the end of instruction. It is the activation of it. In this quiet, your nervous system anchors the decision. In this calm, your mind accepts the covenant. In this silence, your frequency stabilizes. There is no need to rush back into noise. There is no need to seek confirmation from external voices. The sealing has occurred internally. And as you rise from this moment, you do not rise defensive. You rise composed. You do not rise suspicious. You rise discerning. You do not rise loud. You rise aligned. Surveillance may continue, but it no longer intimidates. Because you are no longer broadcasting chaos. You are operating from cloaked stability. And from that stability, your next assignment unfolds quietly, precisely, and without interference.